Ladies and gentlemen, today is an exciting day. This is my homemade shallow water recreational miniature dive tank. Now, wait. I know, a lot of you are rushing to the comment section to say how unsafe homemade underwater breathing devices are, and you're not wrong. I've seen many on the internet that are basically veritable death traps with very low consideration to safety and just basic knowledge. Now, before you go into the comment section, at least take a look at what I've got here. Alright, and one more thing I'd like to mention. Before I even think about taking this in the water and testing it, I'm going to be having it reviewed by a friend of mine who is in fact a certified diver, and I'm going to see what he thinks about it to see if there's any glaring functional flaws, and to learn what I can do to be as safe as possible, at least just to get a test out of it. So allow me to show you exactly what I have built here. Alright, so I'm going to work my way through the air system starting at our supply. Now, you may recognize this. This is a 48 cubic inch, I believe 20 ounce HPA paintball tank, also common for PCP air guns, I believe, and many other applications. But all this is just an aluminum tank, really nothing special. Now, on top of these paintball tanks, you have a regulator. Now, on a standard diving setup, they have two regulators. They have a first stage regulator, which takes down the 3000 psi that would be in a dive tank, or similarly the 3000 psi that's in this tank for this instance, to a reasonable pressure that can be used for your second stage regulator, which is the thing that actually allows you to breathe the same pressure air as there is water around you, if that makes sense. I'll elaborate in a minute. But basically our first stage regulator is here, and we're just using the old paintball regulator, and I know that would not be safe ordinarily because these output 800 psi for a paintball tank. And this is rated at 145, so naturally this would probably fail and release all that pressure into our lungs at once, resulting in a ruptured lung. Bad news. So what I've done is I've actually modified the first stage regulator. I've modified the paintball regulator to only output 135 psi, and I've done so in a safe manner. Allow me to show you how I did that before moving on to the rest. So I'm going to go over the anatomy of a paintball regulator here real quick. You've got your quick fill adapter, and that's where you would hook your either larger air tank for filling or your air pump. And you've got two burst discs for safety, a 5000 psi and a 1.8,000 psi. Basically this interacts with the pressure in the tank, and then this interacts with the pressure after the regulator. Now, this top part here, which is where you screw either the fill adapter, which I'll be going to in a minute, or where you'd actually screw it into the paintball gun, is called the bonnet. It's held on by these two set screws here, and now I'm going to take those off and show you the insides. The modification is very, very simple. So we've taken those two set screws out with an Allen key, and now we can untwist the top of the regulator, otherwise known as the bonnet. One quick thing I'd like to note here too, make sure if you ever fiddle with these that you release all the pressure inside the tank before you even think about unscrewing that, otherwise you might put a bonnet through your drywall. So, first thing you may notice, that spring, that is not standard in a paintball tank. Now this part here, we're going to set the tank aside, I'm going to pull it apart, and this is what we're working with. This little piece here with all the O-rings, just a bit of brass, and this plugs the hole right down in the bottom of this regulator, and this is actually what outputs the 3000 psi through that hole, and this is what blocks it, a little bit of plastic. So the way these work is ordinarily, this one's obviously been modified, but there are stacked all of these little discs here that are actually the springs. Now these are very, very stiff, and generally they would be stacked. You can see they're just basically little washer springs, and there was quite a few of them. They were stacked all the way down to this rubber O-ring, and then they were bookended with these just standard zinc washers. But basically what those springs do is they provide really, really high amount of resistance to this being pushed down to plug the hole in the bottom of that regulator. So in theory, if we weaken that spring, then as the air is moved to the other side of this, it'll push down and block that hole a lot more readily, preferably at around 135 psi, and that's exactly what I did. So I removed all but two of the springs, which are really put together in pairs, so really one set, and then I left the two washers there, and I replaced them with a relatively stiff, but not overly stiff. Now I'm not really sure how to gauge this to tell you what one you can go get, but that's okay, because now is the time I tell you, do not try this at home. This whole project is quite dangerous, and I'm doing it under the advice of professional divers. So please, this is just for entertainment and educational purposes only. Anyway, so this spring goes right on here, butts up against the washer, and all it does is allow less resistance for this to shut the supply of air. So mechanically it doesn't change, and thus it renders it quite safe. And so that's really as simple as that. But anyway, now we're going to reassemble it and move on. So just like that, you've got a regulator that outputs 135 psi. Now, changing the spring tension will change the amount of output air, as is obvious. And so if you are interested in this modification for any other purpose besides diving, because that's stupid, you're gonna have to experiment with proper spring size and tension to reach your desired output pressure. So that's that, my first stage regulator. Now, of course, we need a way to tap into that air supply, and so the way I did that was with a remote fill adapter. Now, let me take this off. And I'll show you what we're working with. This is really quite straightforward. All it does is it screws right onto the regulator on the top of the tank. And then these come with different sized threaded holes on them, and even gauges in some cases. And this one had threads for an 1/8 inch NPT. And so I used an 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch adapter just to get it up to the size of my safety regulator, which is just something I put on, which I'll explain in a second. But yeah, brass fittings, and when you're putting all these together, make sure that you use Teflon because you don't want any air leaking out, because obviously that would limit your time in the water, and it could also potentially be a safety hazard. And when you're threading them in, make sure that you don't have any obstructions like that, which is just there because I took it off, don't worry. But when I put this together, I was very careful not to have any Teflon that could flow through the system and get in anything important, or me, which is also something important. But anyway, next we have a simple air compressor regulator, and this takes 250 psi max, but it takes it down to whatever pressure I want, which will be displayed on this gauge. Now this also has an adjustment for what kind of pressure I want to put into my lungs, but I thought this would be a good sort of another safety feature, if you will. So if I have any air that's maybe leaking slightly faster than I want to or whatever, and this is outputting a volume maybe that didn't seal properly, then this will hopefully, if I'm breathing steadily, won't allow it to reach a dangerous level before I inhale and take that air away from it. So that's why that's there, and I can adjust it like this. Very simple. I'm sure many of you have experience with these. And that's 1/4 inch thread there, there, and there. And here we just have a 1/4 inch elbow, which takes us to the filter. This is an inline filter and oil water separator. Now, when you go to a dive shop and you get a dive tank, or you get a dive tank filled or whatever, their compressors dehumidify the air and clean the air that goes into your tank, just so you don't have any buildup of any crap or water in your tank that could cause problems for obvious reasons. But because I didn't have a way to dehumidify and filter the air going into this tank, instead I decided to do it afterwards, and that's what this is there for. So this will take any oil that comes out of the pump, because it is a hand pump, it's mechanical, it needs lubrication. And it will also take out the water that will come when you condense a lot of air in a large area into a small place like a tank, because of course the water molecules get closer together, they condense out, and they result in liquid water, and I don't want that going through my regulator and into me. And again, that's 1/4 inch MBT there and there. And then over here we have something a little bit different. So this is an actual commercial dive regulator. It is a cheap one, but it is functional, and that's really all I care about. But these have a, I believe, 3/8 by 24 thread. And so we need a way to interface with all of our rest of our 1/4 inch NPT. So I used a 3/8 24 to 1/4 inch NPT adapter. Really simple stuff. And this came with an O-ring to seal against it, so I didn't have to worry about any Teflon there, and that's why you don't see it. But, so now we have our air supply, which supplies 135 psi, or whatever we set on this gauge, to my regulator, which of course is what I hold in my mouth and what I breathe through. Now these are a bit of a nifty thing, and they're also vitally important for underwater breathing, because as you go down beneath the water, the pressure of the water around you increases, of course. But if you have a steady supply of air that allows your lungs to expand at the same rate that they would on the surface, well, that's not going to work down below the surface of the water, because pressure on the surface is 1 bar, or 1 atmospheric pressure, which is about 14.5 psi. And so if I am standing here, or if I'm standing at sea level rather, and I breathe in, I have 14.5 psi in my lungs, and it matches the 14.5 psi around me, of course, because it's an open system. Now, if I'm breathing in 14.5 psi down where there's maybe 2 atmospheres of pressure, like there would be at 30 feet below the surface, then, of course, I wouldn't be able to inhale because the pressure wouldn't be enough to displace the water that would be displaced when my lungs expand. So that's why a second stage regulator is important. Air goes in, and then there's a diaphragm, which is where this purge button, which just lets in air if you're purging your regulator, but that's not something I'll go into. And you can kind of see down in there, the plastic. Basically what happens is the water pressure interacts with that, and it pushes it, and as it pushes it, it lets air in, and then when the air equalizes the pressure to get it back to its static state, which is what the regulator is trying to accomplish, then it cuts your supply of air because no more pressure is needed. So when you inhale, it lowers the pressure behind the regulator, so it gets pushed by the water, and then when you stop breathing in, then the pressure behind it builds up again to the point where it can equalize. So that's why that's really important, and it's often absent from many underwater diving apparatuses. Now, I know what you're thinking, well, this is homemade, yes, and I'm using a commercial regulator, but it's really a safety issue, and also, this really isn't that expensive if you're looking for a budget project, which you should not build. This is about $30 on Amazon, and great reviews, surprisingly. So yeah, that's my setup, and now we're going to take it to a certified diver to have him look it over, and then we're going to take it to a lake, and we're going to test it out. So, hang tight. So I put this together, and I brought it to show a certified diver to make sure that it's going to be safe to use before I actually take it into the water. So this is my homemade small-scale scuba diving apparatus. It's a HBA PCP air gun tank, 3,000 PSI. And I'll go over why it's not as bad of an idea as you think.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's obviously just a small quantity of air.
48 cubic inches.
Is it just like emergency breathing apparatus for actual diving?
So my purpose for building this was just to take it up to lakes in 20 feet or less of water. I'm kind of curious to take it around maybe docks or something and do some searching for goods. So I can give you a rundown of it if you want.
Sure.
Okay. So, like I said, this is a 48 cubic inch, 2,000 PSI tank. And ordinarily, these regulators are made for paintball and they output about 800 PSI. Of course, that's way too much for any of this. So I modified it with a weaker spring, so it provides less resistance, so that you have to get around it and push it closed faster. So it outputs 135 PSI now. So that would be my first stage regulator. And then on top, I've just got an on-off valve. And this would be like a fill valve for a paintball system. And off that, I've got a regulator to take it down to about 100 PSI, sort of as a backup just in case, not that it would hold 3,000 PSI if it rushed forward, but, and because this is actually, can be filled up with a hand pump.
Okay.
And so I don't have dive shot capabilities of dehumidifying and filtering the air before I can put it in. I've got a oil and water separator here. What do you think?
So at 20-foot depth, what do you think your downtime would be?
Not long. I did the math and I think I did it wrong because it said about 13 minutes.
That's really interesting.
Do you think it'll work, and how can I test it safely is really what I want your opinion on. And don't worry, you're not liable if I kill myself.
Well, you first got to find somebody stupider than me.
Okay. I volunteer.
I mean, it's basically the same thing as we use for diving, virtually the same thing, other than it has just a smaller tank.
So there have been many homemade iterations of breathing devices on YouTube.
Right.
And they've all been, frankly, stupid and quite unsafe. So this is my attempt to make one at least as close as I can to an actual diving setup. Yeah. I don't know how much I paid for that. Or will it make you trust it less?
I don't know. I can't read Chinese.
This is a $28 Amazon regulator.
Wow.
These are common for people who do snuba diving.
Snuba.
Yep. Yeah, hooked up to an air compressor.
I think you could easily test it at not at depth.
I'll do a gradual progression, definitely.
And then you're going to have to watch your air, your output air, or maybe this pressure. At 2 feet of depth or 5 feet of depth or something that you can easily just, especially if you're like in a tank or in a shallow area where you can just pop out of the water.
Do you see any immediate safety flaws with it, or?
It's too bad this couldn't be a primary, scuba certified regulator.
Right. But see, those things cost a lot more than a few bucks in plane parts.
Right. So the idea here is to make something really low cost.
Yeah, low cost.
Without the OSHA approval.
Yeah, that you still should not try at home. I've said that like 5 times throughout this video.
You're not at home.
That's a good point. See?
Wow, that's pretty wild.
I thought you were going to say stupid, so I'm already way ahead of the curve.
No, it's...
I tried to think it through, and this is kind of where I got with it. So
it's pretty neat. So what do you have cost-wise invested in the whole thing?
One of the main costs was a hand pump, which is about $100. It pumps up to 2,000 PSI or more even. A little over $100, I think.
So 100 for all of this, and then 100 for the pump.
Just about, yeah.
That's not bad.
All right, so I just thought I'd weigh in really quick. I'm on my way to the lake, and I just wanted to clear up some stuff about asking my friend, a certified diver, some information about my setup there. And I wanted to make something very clear, just to clear him. He does not endorse the usage of this, because obviously, as a certified diver, that'd be very irresponsible for him to promote the usage of something that isn't certified and isn't tested. So he's not doing that. All he was doing was basically going over whether there was any major mechanical or functional flaws, which there is not, and he was telling me what I can do to use it safely, or as safe as I can, because again, it is a homemade diving setup. My handwriting.
You've seen my handwriting. You don't know what it looks like.
I haven't seen your handwriting.
What? No, you haven't.
Yes, I have. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how dead am I?
20.
Good start. New day, new lake. What are my new chances of survival?
Pretty good, I'd say. Probably got a 10 out of 10.
I'll take it. fish right there. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, that project was super fun and I had so much fun making it and using it. It worked way better than I was hoping for. 10 minutes of air, that's crazy. I honestly didn't think that I could get that much out of a 48 cubic inch tank. And I felt fairly safe using it. Not that you should try to replicate what I did at home, but I hope you got some entertainment value out of it, if nothing else, and maybe you learned a few things. Anyway, that's the end. I hope you really enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you want to see more stuff like this, then don't forget to subscribe. If you're interested in seeing more of what I've made, then go check out some of my other videos. They'll be available in just a few seconds. So I guess that's really all there is to say. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video, and have a good day. Oh, and don't harass fish.